The salt air still clung to the fibers of my uniform, a stubborn, honest scent that clashed violently with the manufactured purity of the air inside the house. I pushed the heavy oak front door shut behind me, and the resulting silence swallowed the sound of my worn boots on the imported marble floor. I was home, supposedly, after 3 months of grueling preparation for deployment, but the word felt like a lie on my tongue. This was not my home. It was a museum dedicated to Eleanor's impeccable taste and inherited wealth. The gilded cage. Every time I walked back into that mausoleum, the sense of alienation hit me like a physical blow. The house was enormous, a sprawling monument in Greenwich, Connecticut, built on old money and maintained by meticulous staff who treated me with the polite, distant confusion reserved for delivery drivers. I dragged my battered duffel bag across the polished entryway. It was the only thing I truly owned, a canvas sack filled with practical, hard-earned gear, and it looked ludicrously out of place against the backdrop of an 18th-century Chinese screen. The air smelled of lilies and something expensive and meaningless, a scent designed to mask reality. Nothing here belonged to me. Nothing reflected the life my father and I had carved out before Eleanor arrived, sweeping away our modest, comfortable existence with her relentless pursuit of perfection. I noticed immediately that the massive abstract sculpture I'd hated last Christmas had been replaced by a bronze bust of some Roman general, positioned strategically to catch the afternoon light. Eleanor was constantly curating her environment, making sure every object affirmed her status and underlined the fact that I was merely temporary. I was a stain on the pristine carpet of her life, a logistical error she tolerated for the sake of appearances. I made my way toward the back of the house, where the drawing room overlooked the manicured gardens. The silence was the worst part, the silence of a place where genuine life and laughter were forbidden, replaced by hushed tones and the clinking of crystal. I found my father in his study. He was slumped behind a desk that looked large enough to land a helicopter on, reviewing papers under the cool, unforgiving light of a banker's lamp. He looked exhausted, older than his 57 years. His shoulders permanently bowed beneath a weight I knew was Eleanor's expectation. "Dad?" I said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. He flinched, startled, and then slowly raised his head. His eyes, once so full of genuine warmth and the kind of easy humor I missed desperately, were now guarded, perpetually tired. He avoided meeting my gaze directly, focusing instead on the patch of wall just behind my left ear. "Clara, you're back." "I didn't realize until this morning," he mumbled, pushing a hand through his thinning hair. It was a lie. He knew I was coming. Eleanor had undoubtedly put the information on his schedule like a dental appointment. Just for the night. "I ship out tomorrow morning," I confirmed, trying to keep my voice light, professional. I was leaving the country for 6 months, heading into the rigorous, dangerous life of the merchant marines, and this was the extent of our reunion. He nodded, already looking back down at his documents. "Right? The cargo run? Be careful, kiddo." "I will," I said, the words feeling hollow. I waited, hoping for the old connection to spark a shared memory, a joke, a real question about my work. I wanted him to ask about the ship, about the crew, about the risk. I wanted him to be the man who taught me how to change the oil in his truck, the man who was proud of my independence. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Eleanor is having the staff prepare the blue room for you. Just for tonight. Just for tonight." The implied temporariness was always there. I realized with a sharp, sickening clarity that the man I remembered, the strong, grounded father who loved me unconditionally, was gone. He hadn't been stolen. He had simply retreated, choosing the comfort and ease of Eleanor's money over the difficult task of defending his own daughter. I felt the final, definitive severing of that relationship. It wasn't anger I felt, but a profound, aching resignation. He was complicit in my exile. "Thanks, Dad," I said, pushing off the frame. "Have a good night." He offered a small, weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You too, Clara." I left his study, closing the door softly, sealing him back into his gilded prison. I didn't bother going to the blue room. I knew it would be immaculate, impersonal, and cold. I went straight to the kitchen to find a bottle of water, planning to spend my last few hours stateside, sitting on the back porch, breathing the night air. That's when Eleanor appeared. She didn't enter a room. She materialized, gliding in with the effortless grace of someone who never had to worry about bumping into furniture or getting dirt on her clothes. She was dressed in a sleek, charcoal silk dressing gown, her blonde hair perfectly swept up, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if I had interrupted a very important thought about thread counts. "Clara," she stated, her voice cool and perfectly modulated, She pronounced my name with a slight upward inflection, making it sound like an obligation. Eleanor, I returned, taking a slow sip of water. I stood taller, refusing to shrink under her scrutiny. I understand you are here for a brief visit before your engagement, she said, using the vaguest possible term for my 6-month deployment with a commercial shipping fleet, moving critical supplies across international waters. She wouldn't dignify my actual career with its proper title. I ship out early tomorrow. I wanted to see my father before I go, I explained, trying once more, perhaps for the final time, to bridge the gap with simple, factual communication. I wanted her to grasp the significance of my commitment, the danger, the sheer difficulty of the work. I was seeking not her approval, but perhaps a single, grudging acknowledgement of my existence. Yes, well, please try to limit the disruption, she replied, inspecting her manicure. We have the Wilsons coming for a foundation meeting on Friday. The staff is already overwhelmed preparing for the charity auction. Her priorities were always crystal clear. The appearance of philanthropy trumped genuine human connection every single time. I felt a surge of frustration, quickly followed by the deadening realization that I was wasting my breath. I was about to spend half a year in the punishing environment of the open ocean, risking everything, and she was worried about canips. It's a 6-month deployment, Eleanor. It's the longest one yet, I stated, my voice losing its careful neutrality. I looked straight at her, searching for any flicker of concern, any shadow of empathy. Her eyes, the color of glacial ice, finally met mine. There was no warmth there, only calculation. She paused, setting her jaw, and then, in a voice that was utterly devoid of emotion, she delivered the final, devastating verdict. It was sharp, precise, and intended to obliterate any remaining hope I possessed. Look, Clara, she said, stepping closer, her expensive silk rustling softly. Let's dispense with the pleasantries. I know why you come here. You hold on to this fantasy that, because your father married me, you somehow gain access to my life, my world, or my resources. She laughed, a short, brittle sound that offered no humor. Let me be perfectly clear. So we waste no more time on these sentimental charades. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper that cut through the silence of the house. Asterisk, asterisk, you'll never be family, Clara. You are just a temporary guest in my life, a logistical inconvenience that will expire when you turn 25. Stop trying to force a connection where none exists. Asterisk, asterisk, the words hit me not as an insult, but as an undeniable, physical truth. It was the sound of a bone snapping cleanly. All the years of trying the polite smiles, the attempts at small talk, the desperate hope that if I just proved myself competent, quiet, and unobtrusive enough, she might finally accept me shattered into dust. I felt a sudden, profound emptiness. The humiliation was overwhelming, not because she was cruel, but because she was right. I had been delusional to think I could earn my way into her orbit. I was a temporary fixture, an attachment she couldn't immediately dispose of. My heart didn't break. It hardened. The pain was replaced by a cold, resolute clarity. I finally understood that I had been fighting a war I couldn't win, against an enemy who didn't even recognize me as a threat, only as an annoyance. The departure and the vow, I didn't say anything in return. There was nothing left to say. Her cruelty had done me an unexpected favor. It had liberated me. I simply turned away from her perfectly composed face and walked toward the stairs. I didn't look back at my father's closed study door. I didn't look at the priceless Roman bust. I walked straight to the blue room, grabbed my worn duffel bag, and slung it over my shoulder. My uniform, smelling of diesel and sweat, felt like the only authentic thing in the entire house. It was my true armor, earned by my own labor. I descended the stairs quickly. Eleanor was still standing by the refrigerator, now pouring herself a glass of sparkling water, having already dismissed my existence. I walked past the drawing room and toward the heavy front door. I paused only when my hand was on the brass handle. I looked back, taking in the oppressive grandeur one last time. The soaring ceilings, the muted, expensive colors, the sheer, suffocating weight of wealth. It was a beautiful, terrible prison. Then, I stepped out into the cool night air, pulling the door shut behind me with a decisive click that felt loud in the stillness. I walked down the long sweeping driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. I didn't glance toward the distant, darkened windows. I focused on the road ahead, the destination being the port, the ship, and the semi-sanctuary. As I walked, I made a silent, fierce vow, one that felt more binding than any legal contract. I swore that I would never again allow myself to be vulnerable to them. I would finish this deployment, return, and cut every single tether that connected me to this house, to Eleanor's malice, and to my father's cowardice. I would sever all ties. I would be completely and utterly free, even if it meant sacrificing every shred of inherited comfort. I was done being a temporary guest. I was done trying to be family. When I returned, I would ensure that Eleanor never had the chance to look down on me again. My life would be entirely my own, built on the strength of my back and the indifference of the ocean. The moment the gangplank was retracted and the heavy mooring lines were hauled in, I felt the sickening lurch of true separation. I stood on the deck of the *MV Triton*, watching the skyline of the Cydia skyline that held the sterile monument Eleanor called home recede into the haze. I didn't wave. I didn't look for my father. I simply turned and walked toward the heart of the ship, embracing the noise and the grit that were now my only reality. My deployment with the Merchant Marines was a calculated escape. 6 months of relentless, grueling labor, designed to demand every ounce of my focus and physical strength. It was the perfect antidote to the soft, suffocating cruelty of Eleanor's world. Life below deck was a sensory assault. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the metallic temps of salt spray and the constant, overwhelming smell of diesel fuel. The engine room was my primary domain, a cavern of throbbing steel and deafening sound. The vibration was constant, a low, mechanical hum that burrowed deep into my bones, becoming the rhythm of my existence. It was a physical state of being that left no room for introspection or self-pity. I worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer if a system failed. My hands were perpetually stained with grease and oil, my uniform stiff with dried sweat. I knew every gauge, every valve, every temperamental circuit breaker in that vast, churning machine. And in that competence, I found a profound, undeniable peace. Here, on the *Triton*, my worth was measurable. It was not based on my bloodline, my manners, or my ability to blend into a ridiculously wealthy tableau. It was based on whether I could keep the main propulsion running in a Category 3 storm. My crewmates, hardened taciturn men and women who had spent their lives navigating the world's indifferent oceans, didn't care that my stepmother lived in a mansion in Greenwich. They cared if I showed up on time, if I pulled my weight, and if I knew how to patch a leak in the hydraulics at 3 a.m. They were my true family now. We shared the same exhaustion, the same foul coffee, and the same dark humor. There was an honesty to the work, a brutal clarity that I had craved for years. When Chief Miller told me, "Good job, Clara," it meant something. It meant the ship wouldn't sink. It was validation earned through blisters and sleepless watches, not inherited through a negligent father. The sea itself became my shield. It was vast, indifferent, and utterly beautiful in its terrifying power. When I managed a few moments alone on the bridge wing late at night, staring out at the limitless black water and the brilliant, uncaring stars, I felt truly safe. The ocean was too immense to care about Eleanor's petty malice. It swallowed up the memory of her crushing words, dissolving them into the endless roar of the waves. During those long stretches, I consciously locked away the memory of the house, the sterile wealth, and the pain. Everything connected to that life was sealed off, except for one fragile thread: Beatrice. Eleanor's mother, Beatrice, was the ghost in that gilded cage. I barely knew her in person. She was often traveling or confined to her own wing of the estate. But over the years, she had occasionally sent me letters. They were always neat, written on heavy, cream-colored stationery, and they were the only things I ever received from that family that didn't feel like a subtle insult. Beatrice never mentioned Eleanor's behavior. She never offered pity or criticism. Instead, she asked about my career. "How is the navigation course coming along, dear?" She would write, "I always admired the precision required to move mountains of cargo." Across the globe, she asked about my favorite ports of call, about the challenges of engine maintenance, about my plans for the future. She saw me not as Eleanor's inconvenient stepdaughter, but as a competent, ambitious person. I kept those few letters tucked inside my worn duffel bag, folded carefully next to my navigation manuals. They were the only proof that someone in that lineage had ever seen me clearly, without the filter of entitlement or disdain. They were a quiet, steady counterpoint to Eleanor's constant, grating dismissal. 6 weeks into the deployment, deep into the monotonous routine of the Pacific crossing, our rhythm was abruptly broken. We received an urgent signal to divert course and put into a small, nondescript port in the Philippines. We needed emergency repairs on a vital piece of auxiliary equipment that couldn't wait until the next scheduled stop. The port was a clutter of rusty cranes and stacked containers, smelling of fish and hot asphalt. While the technicians swarmed the machinery, I had a brief window of opportunity to use the ship's limited satellite communications, privilege usually reserved for essential company business. I logged in quickly, intending only to check my bank balance and perhaps send a single clipped email to my father confirming I was alive and well, thereby fulfilling my bare minimum obligation. Instead, I found a forwarded message buried in my inbox, sent not by my father, but by his executive assistant, Mr. Henderson. The subject line was chillingly formal, regarding the estate of Beatrice Thorne. My stomach clenched. I opened the email. It was short, cold, and entirely professional. It stated that Beatrice Thorne, Eleanor's mother, had passed away peacefully 2 weeks prior at her residence. It included a formal notification of death and contact information for the estate lawyer. I leaned against the bulkhead, the humid air heavy around me, staring at the screen. Beatrice was gone. The shock was immediate, yet strangely detached. The massive distance, the physical exhaustion of the last 6 weeks, and the emotional severing I had already performed meant that true grief felt impossible. I barely knew her. She was a quiet presence, a signature on a few kind letters. But, as I reread the formal notice, a heavy pang of loss resonated in my chest. She was the last tether. The last person connected to that sprawling, dysfunctional family who had ever offered me genuine warmth, unburdened by judgment. Now, that final, fragile link was severed. The world that contained her quiet encouragement was gone. My mind immediately jumped to Eleanor. I could picture her perfectly, the impeccable black dress, the air of martyred sorrow, and the underlying, calculating focus on the inevitable inheritance. Eleanor, the dutiful only daughter, would now claim everything. I felt a surge of cold indifference toward the entire situation. It was none of my business. Beatrice's passing was sad, yes, but it didn't change my mission. I had vowed to cut ties, and this event only solidified the finality of that decision. The inheritance, the drama, the inevitable squabbling knit, was all Eleanor's problem now. I quickly deleted the email, forcing myself to compartmentalize the news. My job demanded my focus. I had a faulty hydraulic pump waiting for me in the bowels of the ship, and the captain was waiting for a status report. The sea does not tolerate distraction or mourning. I spent the next 4 months focused entirely on the navigation charts, the engine pressure, and the intricate dance of keeping a massive cargo ship moving across the globe. Beatrice's death became a distant, almost abstract event, overshadowed by the immediate, demanding reality of my life. I worked. I ate. I slept in short, staggered bursts. I counted the days, not until we reached port, but until my contract was fulfilled. I pictured the moment I would step off the Triton for the last time, carrying only my worn duffel bag and my absolute freedom. I would find a small apartment, maybe in Seattle or San Francisco, somewhere anonymous. I would use the savings I had meticulously accrued and start a life entirely on my own terms. I would call my father only to inform him that I was officially resigning from the role of his stepdaughter. I would never set foot in Eleanor's house again. The anticipation of that freedom was the fuel that kept me going through the longest watches and the most punishing repairs. I pushed the memory of Beatrice, the thought of Eleanor's inevitable entitlement, and the whole painful history of my stepfamily out of my mind. I was nearing the end of the deployment. The coast of the United States was finally within our reach. I felt lighter, harder, and ready. I was coming home, not to family, but to the independence I had earned 1,000 times over. I was finally going to erase them all from my orbit forever. I was ready to be free. The smell of the dock hit me first, a thick, powerful blend of salt spray, diesel fumes, and wet rope. It was the smell of home, not the sterile polished hell I had just spent 6 months trying to forget, but the rough, honest reality of my working life. We tied up at the New Jersey terminal just past dawn. The air was cold, damp, and promised rain. My body was singing a song of exhaustion, a deep, rhythmic ache that only constant vibration and heavy lifting can produce. I was ready to peel off my utility clothes, shed my sea legs, and disappear into the anonymity of solid ground. I carried my canvas duffel bag, the same worn, patched bag that held everything I truly owned over my shoulder. I didn't wait for the official debriefing. My paperwork was clean, my contract fulfilled. I needed nothing from the company but my final paycheck, and I certainly needed nothing from the mainland but a cheap motel room and silence. Stepping off the gangplank felt like landing on a different planet. For 6 months, the world had been defined by the shifting horizon and the relentless grind of the engine. Now, the ground was stable, and the air was still. I felt dizzy, physically disoriented by the sudden lack of motion. I walked past the stacks of containers, heading toward the main gate, anticipating the glorious freedom of hailing a cab and never looking back. I had my exit strategy planned: a small apartment, a new job application, and a permanent block on my father's number. Freedom was the only inheritance I sought. Then, I saw him. He was standing near a stack of bright red cargo containers, a stark, almost absurd contrast to the industrial grit surrounding him. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked tailored in London, shoes polished to a mere shine, and carried a slim, dark leather briefcase. He looked like he had materialized directly from a corporate boardroom, utterly out of place among the grease-stained workers and the roar of the loading cranes. I slowed my pace, confusion replacing my exhaustion. He wasn't a dock worker, a customs official, or anyone I recognized from the shipping line. He looked like an attorney, or perhaps a high-level executive, someone who dealt with millions, not with tired sailors. As I approached, he straightened his tie, his gaze sharp and assessing. He wasn't looking for a sailor. He was looking for Clara, he asked, his voice smooth and carrying a distinct East Coast formality. That depends, I replied, keeping my duffel bag tight against my body. Who's asking? He offered a small, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. My name is Sterling. Elias Sterling. I am an attorney with Sterling Hayes and Associates. I represent the estate of Beatrice Thorne. My stomach tightened instantly. Beatrice, Eleanor's mother. The one kind soul in that entire gilded, poisonous family structure. I received a notice about her passing a few months back, I said, trying to sound detached. I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't see how this concerns me. It concerns you very much, Miss Clara, he said, gesturing toward the gate. I realize you've had a long voyage, but this is a matter of immediate legal import. Could we find someplace quiet? Perhaps a coffee shop? Suspicion hardened into outright wariness. Nothing good ever came from that side of the family, even indirectly. I assumed this was some bureaucratic cleanup, perhaps involving my father's taxes, or some minor debt. I have 5 minutes, I conceded. The diner across the street, I need strong coffee. We walked in silence. The contrast between my battered utility boots and his pristine leather soles echoed the chasm between our two worlds. The diner was cramped, smelling of stale grease and burnt coffee. We slid into a worn vinyl booth in the back. I ordered a black coffee, double cup. Mr. Sterling requested hot water and produced a small, silver tin of expensive tea bags from his briefcase. The sheer absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh. He didn't waste time. He opened his briefcase, retrieved a thick sheaf of documents secured with a heavy rubber band, and placed them on the sticky Formica table. Miss Thorne passed away 6 weeks ago, he began, his tone purely professional, devoid of emotion. Her will was recently admitted to probate. While the general disposition of assets is complex, there is one item I must address with you immediately. I took a long, hot sip of coffee, bracing myself for whatever complicated misery was about to be unloaded onto my plate. Eleanor Thorne, your stepmother, and her siblings were, shall we say, anticipating a substantial inheritance. They were, naturally, disappointed. I felt a sudden, sharp jolt of adrenaline. Disappointed? How? Sterling paused, allowing the weight of his next words to settle. Beatrice Thorne chose to entirely disinherit all 3 of her natural children. That includes Eleanor. The coffee almost went down the wrong pipe. I coughed, trying to clear the sudden, stunned silence in my throat. Eleanor cut out. The woman who built her entire identity around her family's legacy, who treated her own mother's wealth like a personal bank account, was getting nothing. A dark, undeniable surge of satisfaction washed over me. It was a vindication so immense, so absolute, that it momentarily eclipsed my confusion. I pictured Eleanor's face, red with fury, realizing her mother had delivered the ultimate final judgment. That's quite a decision, I managed, my voice rough. But why are you telling me this, Mr. Sterling? I barely knew Beatrice. We exchanged letters a few times a year. Sterling pushed the main document, a summary of assets and bequests across the table, toward me. Beatrice Thorne was a woman who valued character above all else, Miss Clara. She spent years observing her family, and unfortunately, she found them wanting. She also spent years observing you, through your correspondence and reports from her staff. He tapped a precise, bolded line near the bottom of the page. Miss Thorne chose to leave the entirety of her residuary estate to one individual, citing that person as the only member of her extended family who demonstrated integrity, commitment, and genuine self-reliance. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I was misreading the line. My eyes scanned the text, struggling to process the legal jargon until they landed on the staggering figure. $8 million? $8 million. The number hung in the stale diner air, heavy and unreal. It was a figure that belonged on a balance sheet in Manhattan, not scrawled onto a document sitting next to my mug of cheap coffee. It was more money than I could earn in 100 lifetimes working the decks. The weight of the sea, the physical exhaustion of the last 6 months, vanished, replaced by a cold, dizzying vertigo. This can't be right, I whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the paper, half expecting the ink to smudge or the number to vanish. There must be a mistake. I'm a merchant marine officer. I work on cargo ships. There is no mistake, Miss Clara, Sterling confirmed, his voice flat. The will is airtight. Beatrice Thorne was explicit. She specifically detailed that her estate was to go to you, citing the clause that named you the primary victim of Eleanor Thorne's sustained cruelty and malice. He pointed to a brief handwritten codicil that had been meticulously transcribed and notarized. I read Beatrice's precise, damning words, asterisk to Clara, who was repeatedly denied her rightful place by my daughter's malice. She is the true inheritor of my values and deserves the means to pursue her life free from their toxic influence. Asterisk, a profound silence descended, broken only by the clatter of plates in the kitchen. Beatrice hadn't just left me money. She had delivered the ultimate public rebuke to her own daughter, and she had used me, the outsider, as her instrument. I realized then that those quiet, encouraging letters she sent me over the years weren't just polite correspondence. They were character assessments. She had been watching, calculating, and planning my escape route all along. The shock was overwhelming, but it was quickly chased by a cold, sobering fear. $8 million wasn't freedom. It was a target painted on my back. Mr. Sterling, observing my reaction with unnerving calm, leaned closer. Which brings me to the immediate complication. I needed to find you immediately upon your return because, as you might imagine, Eleanor and her siblings are not taking this development well. I can only imagine, I muttered, picturing the explosion that must have occurred in that sterile, gilded house. They are already mounting a furious legal challenge, he stated plainly. They are claiming that you, Miss Clara, somehow manipulated an elderly, vulnerable woman while you were conveniently deployed at sea. They are arguing undue influence, fraud, and mental incapacity. The familiar sting of Eleanor's malice returned, but this time, it was magnified by the stakes. She wouldn't just try to humiliate me. She would try to destroy me legally and financially. She would use every ounce of her entitlement and her family's considerable legal resources to prove I was nothing but a greedy, opportunistic child. They are desperate, and they are dangerous, Sterling warned, his eyes finally showing a flicker of concern. They are demanding depositions, attempting to freeze the assets, and trying to discredit your character. If they succeed, they will not only reclaim the money, but they will leave you financially and legally ruined. I looked down at the inheritance summary. Then, at my own rough, calloused hands, I had come home seeking quiet independence, ready to erase my stepfamily from my life. Instead, I had been thrust into a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar war against them. The shock subsided, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. This wasn't just money. This was Beatrice's legacy, her final act of faith in me. I would not let Eleanor trample over that, the same way she had tried to trample over me for years. I met Mr. Sterling's gaze, the weariness gone, replaced by the steely focus I usually reserved for navigating storms. Tell me what we do next, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice steady and hard. I'm not running from this. I didn't ask for this fight, but I will not let her win. I had traded the rhythmic, predictable violence of the ocean for the cold, calculated aggression of high-stakes American probate law. The transition was jarring, like walking straight off the deck of a rolling tanker and into a glass and marble mausoleum. A crash course in wealth. Mr. Sterling's office was perched impossibly high above the city, a sanctuary of hushed power and expensive silence. Everything smelled of polished mahogany and subtle, unattainable wealth. I sat in a chair so plush I felt I might sink into it entirely, still wearing the cargo pants and worn utility jacket I had pulled on after leaving the ship, my only non-uniform clothes. They felt coarse and out of place against the backdrop of original abstract art and the distant, muted roar of traffic far below. Clara, Mr. Sterling began, his voice impeccably modulated, sliding a thick binder across the expansive desk. We need to understand what we are defending. This is not simply a bank account. I nodded, gripping the edge of the binder. I was ready to learn. On the ship, Competence was survival. Here, knowledge was the only armor I possessed against Eleanor's inevitable onslaught. He spent the next 2 hours giving me a crash course in the architecture of Beatrice's fortune. It wasn't just the $8 million in liquid assets I had seen on the summary. It was the portfolio, the municipal bonds, the blue-chip stocks, the percentage ownership in a small, profitable real estate trust. He detailed the brownstone in Brooklyn that Beatrice had held onto for 40 years, and the small, quiet cottage upstate. I felt a dizzying pressure replace the physical strain of my deployment. Managing engine pressure or navigating a storm felt simple compared to understanding tax implications and fiduciary duties. I realized then that Beatrice hadn't just given me money. She had given me a responsibility, a position, and a target painted squarely on my back. Eleanor's claim, naturally, Sterling continued, tapping a pencil against the desk, is that you preyed on her mother's failing health and manipulated her into signing a new will? She is already filing motions for discovery, attempting to paint you as an opportunistic, estranged relative who showed up only when the money was involved. I felt the familiar, hot rush of anger. Eleanor was incapable of seeing integrity in anyone else because she lacked it herself. She projected her own greed onto me. But this time, the anger was quickly channeled into focus. I was tired of being the target, the outsider, the temporary inconvenience. This was my fight now, and I had the resources, Beatrice's resources, to win it. I didn't manipulate her, Mr. Sterling, I stated, my voice low and steady. I barely saw her. She wrote me letters. I wrote her back. That was the extent of our relationship. Precisely, he affirmed, a slight smile touching his lips. And that, Clara, is our strength. Her evidence is manufactured malice. Ours is documented history and Beatrice's clear, sound mind. Number # Eleanor's. Assault, the legal assault began immediately and was as relentless as a hurricane. Eleanor didn't just file papers. She waged psychological warfare. My phone, which had been silent for 6 months, save for technical updates, began ringing constantly with numbers I didn't recognize. Sterling intercepted most of the legal threats, but some of the personal attacks slipped through. I received a vicious, anonymous letter clearly penned by Eleanor tailing my failures as a stepdaughter and claiming I was unfit to handle a fraction of this wealth, let alone the whole estate. She even brought my father into it, claiming I had abandoned him for my career at sea, a complete inversion of the truth. I listened to a particularly venomous voicemail she left on Sterling's secure line, which he played for me to prepare me for her demeanor in court. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the recording like broken glass. She accused me of being a gold-digging tramp who had charmed her senile mother. The sting was familiar, the same humiliation I had felt in her drawing room months ago. But this time, it didn't paralyze me. It fueled me. Every accusation she hurled was proof of her desperation and her fundamental inability to comprehend human connection that wasn't transactional. She couldn't understand why her own mother would cut her off, so she had to invent a villain me. We need to document every single piece of communication, Sterling instructed, his face impassive. Every threat, every lie, it illustrates her character and her motive for contesting the will. Pure, unadulterated avarice. I spent hours with him and his paralegal, sifting through years of fragmented records. My father's assistant had forwarded the few letters Beatrice had sent me while I was at sea. Reading them now, in the sterile environment of a corporate law firm, I saw them not as sweet notes from a distant relative, but as quiet, deliberate acts of defiance. One afternoon, Sterling laid out a timeline that redefined everything I thought I knew about Beatrice. The will you saw, the one naming you as the sole beneficiary, wasn't drawn up a week before her passing. Clara, he said, sliding a document with a notarized date from 18 months prior. It was drafted and finalized long before her health began to seriously decline. She was entirely lucid. I stared at the date, 18 months ago. That was around the time I had last visited the house. The visit where Eleanor had been particularly dismissive, treating me like a stray cat that had wandered onto her Persian rug. And this, Sterling said, pulling out a slim file, is even more telling. It was a record of background checks. Beatrice had hired a private investigator to look into my life, not to dig up dirt, but to verify my character. The reports detailed my service record in the Merchant Marines, my spotless disciplinary history, my dedication to my education, and even my volunteer work at a maritime youth center during my brief shore leaves. I felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in my chest. Beatrice hadn't just hoped I was worthy. She had investigated it. She had quietly watched me from afar, assessing whether I possessed the integrity she knew her own children lacked. She knew, I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a rogue wave. She knew exactly how Eleanor treated me, and she was testing me to see if I was strong enough to stand on my own. Sterling nodded slowly. She didn't leave you the money as a gift, Clara. She left it to you as a trust. She saw you, the outsider, as the only true inheritor of her values: discipline, hard work, and loyalty. She made sure the will explicitly detailed why her biological children were excluded, a demonstrable pattern of self-interest and lack of filial concern, which stands in stark contrast to the diligence and moral fortitude shown by my step-granddaughter, Clara. Reading those words, printed in the cold, precise language of the law, felt like an embrace. Beatrice had provided me with the ultimate vindication, a posthumous endorsement that shattered years of Eleanor's carefully constructed dismissal. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting to uphold the judgment of the only person in that family who had ever truly seen me. My focus sharpened into a laser point. The fatigue of the voyage was replaced by the adrenaline of the looming confrontation. I moved into a temporary, quiet apartment near Sterling's office, shedding the last vestiges of my life at sea. My days became consumed by legal strategy. I reviewed the correspondence between Beatrice and me until I could recite passages by heart. We catalogued every piece of evidence showing my distance from the family, disproving Eleanor's claim that I was constantly hovering, waiting for the inheritance. I learned the meaning of terms like *undue influence*, testamentary capacity*, and *fiduciary responsibility*. I needed to be more than just the beneficiary. I needed to be the most informed person in the courtroom about the validity of that will. Sterling coached me on my demeanor. In court, you are not the sailor, and you are certainly not the victim, Clara. You are the legal steward of Beatrice's legacy. You will be calm, factual, and utterly unimpeachable. Every time Eleanor or her counsel tries to bait you, remember that Beatrice chose you for your steady character. I practiced answering hypothetical questions, stripping my tone of any emotion. I realized that my years of discipline on the ship, the necessity of keeping fear and fatigue locked down to perform critical tasks, had prepared me perfectly for this sterile, high-stakes environment. I was used to operating under pressure, with millions of dollars of cargo at risk. Now, the cargo was my future, and Beatrice's honor. I stopped seeing Eleanor's attacks as personal slights and started viewing them as tactical errors. Every exaggerated accusation she made only served to highlight her own instability and rage, reinforcing the very reasons Beatrice had disinherited her. I was ready to face her, not with sadness or anger, but with the quiet, devastating power of the law. The transformation, the last piece of preparation, was the most symbolic. Sterling insisted that I appear in court looking the part of a serious inheritor, not a recently returned sailor. We went to a high-end tailor in a quiet part of the city. I felt ridiculous standing on the pedestal, the measuring tape wrapping around my shoulders and waist. I was accustomed to uniforms designed for utility, for surviving fire or freezing spray. This suit was designed for authority. I chose a charcoal gray wool, heavy and structured. It wasn't about style, it was about armor. I needed to project permanence, the very quality Eleanor had always denied me. When the tailor finished the first fitting, I walked over to the full-length mirror. For months, I had seen a tired reflection, the stress lines around my eyes, the sun-bleached hair pulled back in a practical braid. But in the suit, something shifted. The tailoring forced me to stand straighter, my shoulders squared, reminiscent of my posture on the bridge. The gray fabric was sharp, serious, and utterly devoid of compromise. I looked at the person staring back, not the temporary guest, not the unwanted stepdaughter, but the inheritor, the steward. The transformation was complete. I no longer needed to hide from the house, the wealth, or Eleanor's judgment. I was walking into the courtroom, armed with Beatrice's faith and 8 million reasons why Eleanor could no longer dismiss me. I was ready for war. The air in the probate court was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood. It was an atmosphere built for serious business, hushed and formal, a universe away from the salt spray and diesel fumes I was used to. This was the final battleground, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for survival against a storm or a faulty engine. I was fighting for my dignity against the woman who had spent years trying to erase me. I sat ramrod straight at the plaintiff's table, my tailored suit feeling like a second skin, a uniform of quiet authority. Mr. Sterling, beside me, looked calm and utterly prepared, his confidence a solid anchor in the swirling tension. I kept my hands folded on the table, stilling the slight tremor of nervous energy that wanted to escape. Forcing myself into the stoic posture I maintained on the bridge of a cargo ship during heavy weather, across the aisle, they were arrayed against me. Eleanor, flanked by her 2 siblings, brother and sister I barely knew. both possessing the same brittle, entitled air looked magnificent and terrifying. She was dressed in aggressive black, a severe suit that seemed designed to absorb all light and sympathy. Her siblings wore matching expressions of tight-lipped fury, their presence serving only to amplify the collective malice directed my way. They were a tableau of inherited resentment, united in their shock that a mere temporary guest dared to challenge their birthright. I met Eleanor's gaze as the clerk called the court to order. Her eyes were chips of ice, promising vengeance. She tried the old trick, the slow, dismissive scan from my shoes up to my face, designed to make me feel small, cheap, and utterly out of place. But I didn't flinch. I held her stare, not with defiance, but with a profound, unsettling calmness. I was no longer the frightened, seeking teenager, desperate for acceptance. I was the steward of Beatrice's legacy, and I had 8 million reasons to stand my ground. The proceedings began. A tedious ballet of legal jargon and procedural formalities that felt painfully slow given the emotional stakes. Their lawyer, a man whose expensive silk tie looked like it was choking him, launched into a predictable but vicious attack. He painted me as a manipulative opportunist, a sailor who had charmed a frail old woman in her last days, exploiting her loneliness for financial gain. He cited my transient lifestyle, my lack of family ties, and my perceived distance from the true familial heart of the estate. Every word was a familiar dagger, echoing the accusations Eleanor had been whispering for years. But now, they had no power. I listened to the slander with the detached professionalism I used when reviewing hazardous cargo manifests. It was noise. It was their strategy. And I knew, thanks to Mr. Sterling, that it was destined to fail. Mr. Sterling's turn was a masterpiece of clinical precision. He didn't rely on emotion. He simply presented the facts. Beatrice's sound mental state at the time the will was executed. The meticulous documentation, the detailed letters she had written to me over the years proving our relationship she had deliberately hidden from Eleanor. He read excerpts aloud, simple words of encouragement about my career, questions about the mechanics of the ship, expressions of pride in my dedication. As Sterling read, I saw a flicker of genuine panic cross Eleanor's face. She hadn't just lost the money. She was losing the narrative. She had always believed that she controlled her mother's reality, that her mother was as cold and dismissive of me as she was. The revelation of Beatrice's quiet, steady support was the real betrayal to Eleanor, far worse than the financial loss. Finally, the judge, a woman with silver hair and an air of absolute authority, cleared her throat. The room went utterly silent. I could hear the faint whirring of the air conditioning, the only sound besides the judge's measured voice. She began by addressing the burden of proof, systematically dismantling the claims of undue influence. She cited the clear, unambiguous language of the final testament. She noted that Beatrice had explicitly stated her intent to leave her estate to Clara, my full name. In recognition of her integrity and character, qualities notably absent in my direct descendants. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Integrity, character, absent in my direct descendants. I watched Eleanor's composure shatter. Her shoulders slumped infinitesimally, but the change was profound. This wasn't just a legal ruling. It was a verdict on her life, delivered posthumously by the person whose love she had taken for granted. Therefore, the judge concluded, her voice ringing with finality, the court finds that the last will and testament of Beatrice Sterling is valid and binding. The estate is hereby ordered to be distributed as stipulated therein. The gavel struck the woodblock *thwack, *ka, sound that echoed the finality of a steel hatch slamming shut. It was over. A quiet wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. It was the feeling of steering through the eye of a hurricane and finding smooth water on the other side. Mr. Sterling placed a congratulatory hand on my shoulder, but I barely registered it. I was focused entirely on the woman across the aisle. Eleanor's face was a mask of incandescent rage, tinged with a devastating realization of her own failure. As the lawyers began to gather their papers, Eleanor leaned forward, her voice a low, venomous hiss, designed only for my ears. "You think you've won, you little mercenary? This changes nothing. You'll always be a vulgar outsider. You'll never be family." It was the same insult, the same calculated cruelty she had hurled at me months ago before I sailed. It was her final, desperate attempt to reclaim control, to inflict a psychological wound she had perfected over years. I stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of my jacket. I didn't rush. I waited until I was directly in front of her table, forcing her to look up at me. I met her gaze, no anger in my eyes, only cold, hard truth. "You're right, Eleanor. I said, my voice low but firm, ensuring only she could hear the words. I was never family to you. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her anticipate the rest of the sentence. But your own mother thought differently. I saw the devastating realization wash over her, the understanding that her greed, her relentless malice, her need to exclude me, had not only driven me into the arms of her mother, but had provided Beatrice with the perfect, undeniable moral justification to cut her out completely. Every cruel word Eleanor had ever spoken to me was a brick in the wall that now separated her from her inheritance. I turned and walked away. I did not look back at her siblings' sputtering indignation or the ruin etched on Eleanor's face. That moment of quiet triumph was enough. I left her with nothing but the consequence of her own actions. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt warm and real. The weight I had carried for years, the burden of trying to belong, the pain of rejection was gone, replaced by the strange, exhilarating lightness of absolute freedom. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, signatures, and learning the lexicon of wealth management. $8 million was not just a number. It was a vast, complex machine of trusts, stocks, and properties. I spent hours with Mr. Sterling, reviewing documents that represented more money than I could have earned in 3 lifetimes at sea. But the money itself was secondary. The true inheritance was the validation Beatrice had given me. She hadn't just left me funds. She had left me a legacy built on character. Months later, I stood in Mr. Sterling's office, signing the final, necessary documents. I was no longer wearing my sailor's clothes or the nervous look of a novice. I was confident, pragmatic, and focused. The documents were for the establishment of the Beatrice Sterling Foundation. I had decided early on that the money must serve a purpose that honored Beatrice's quiet faith in me and my own background. The foundation was dedicated to providing scholarships and mentorship for underprivileged young adults seeking careers in the merchant marines and related maritime trades. It was a pathway out, a chance for competence and hard work to be recognized, free from the constraints of birthright or social standing. As I signed the papers, the ink drying on the final legal decree, I felt a deep, profound connection to the woman who had saved me. Beatrice had seen me, truly seen me, when everyone else in her world had dismissed me. She had used her wealth not as a tool of exclusion, but as an instrument of justice and opportunity. I looked out the window of the Hyries office, down at the bustling city below. I was still Clara, the sailor. But now I was also the inheritor, the founder, the steward. The fight was over, and I had won not by becoming one of them, but by remaining resolutely myself. I had finally achieved the recognition and peace I deserved. Not through forced belonging, but through empowered purpose. I was free, and that freedom, paid for by Beatrice's profound faith, was worth more than all the gold in the world.